The focus of this morning is humility. And you will see this in extraordinary ways through Ruth, through character Boaz, who we haven't met yet, but the hero of the story. And just some beautiful things going on here and how it fits with our volunteering capacity and the ways that we serve. One of the things, so Sarah right now is in Broken Bow. She's at a wedding shower, so she couldn't be here today, which means I actually get to say anything I want about her, and she can't defend herself. But as you may know, I'm doing a lot of weddings, and this is wedding season, and we're getting ready to celebrate that with couples, and we do some pretty intense premarital counseling. Now, one of the benefits as a pastor of me doing that is that I get a weekly reminder of how to be a good husband and how to try to have a good marriage every time I meet with these couples, because I'm teaching them and reminding them of things that sometimes I fall short in my own marriage. So one of the things I always tell couples, and I learned this because Sarah and we once went to Virginia to visit a cousin, and we were at my cousin's church, and it was a smaller church, so everyone was talking to everyone, and we talked to this guy, we were getting coffee. You know, we're trying to kind of sneak through, because unless you're comfortable at your own setting, like, you don't want to really get picked on or paid too much attention to or made walk down a red carpet. But there we were, and so this guy met us and figured out who we were, and we said, we're engaged, and we're, pretty excited, and he says, okay, well, I want to give you one piece of advice. They say it's 50-50, right? And we're like, oh no, he's going to tell us that, because we were wrestling with this a little bit, like we fully believe in seeing it now, but we were like, he's going to tell us that the man's supposed to be like 70 and the wife's supposed to be 30, and Sarah's not going to really deal with that very well. And instead, he said, it's not 50-50. It's 100-100. So that way, when your 100% only equals 30% of the load, both of you know that you're still giving it your all. And I thought that was pretty brilliant. And a lot of that has to do with humility, what we're going to study today. So let's turn to Ruth chapter 2. As you're making your way to Ruth chapter 2, I want to remind you that there's always an outline on the back of your program that you can follow along with that. We'll be filling in some blanks. You can guess at them. You can take that home and study it for the rest of the week. Also, if you don't have a Bible, we always have Bibles available right up there on that table. You can grab one, write your name in it, make it your own. We don't want it back unless it's in your hands. Where we left off last week is that Ruth and Naomi were in Moabite country. Ruth is a Moabite. Naomi is an Israelite. Naomi went with her husband and her sons to Moab to escape a famine. Things went south. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, and her two sons all passed away, leaving three widowed women. Now, one of the sister-in-laws or the daughter-in-laws went back to her people, but Ruth said, okay, Naomi, we're going back to the Israelite country. I will go with you. And it's extraordinary because Naomi was saying, no, don't come with me. It's the worst thing you can possibly do with your life. And she says, I'm going. So this is what happens. They're back in their homeland. Their community is astounded to see that Naomi is so destitute and empty-handed. And beginning in verse 2, now Naomi had a respected relative, a man of worth, through her husband from the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the daughter-in-law, said to Naomi, let me go to the field so that I may glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose eyes I might find favor. Naomi replied to her, go, my daughter. So she went. She arrived and she gleaned in the field behind the harvesters. By chance, it happened to be the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was from the family of Elimelech. So here's Ruth, and she decides that she's going to do something about their destitution. And the one thing that she can do is she can actually walk behind the harvesters. This is the barley harvest we told in chapter 1. And they've got these ears of barley, and they might miss one or two down the row. So when it says that they could glean, the people of poverty could follow along and actually pick up the scraps. It's actually noted in several places, but specifically in Leviticus, God tells the Israelites, when you harvest your fields, do not go back through and pick up the scraps. Let those who are in destitution pick them up so that they might have something to eat. So they're doing just that, and Ruth is participating in that. So there she is. Verse 4, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. He said to the harvesters, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." And then Boaz said to his young man, the one who was overseeing the harvesters, this is I'm going to give you a little taste of the coming chapters, the beginning of a little bit of a romance here. That's the title of the sermon series, after all, talking about relationships here. Boaz says to the harvesters, he says, "To whom does this young woman belong?" Now you have to remember that Ruth is not the only gleaner in the field. So Boaz is looking out, and he's taking a survey of his workers, of his harvesters, and of all the gleaners, and he's like, wait a minute. Who's she? Verse 6, the young man who was overseeing the harvester answered, "She's a young Moabite woman, the one who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean that I might gather up grain from among the bundles behind the harvesters.' She arrived and has been on her feet from the morning until now and has sat down only for a moment." Boaz then approached Ruth and he says, "Haven't you understood, my daughter? Don't go glean in any other field. Don't go anywhere else. Instead, stay here with my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that they are harvesting and go along after them. I've ordered the young men not to assault you. Whenever you are thirsty, go to the jugs and drink from the young men, from what the young men have filled." Now, so the law said that they had to that they shouldn't go and pick up the extra barley. But there's nothing in there that says that they had to be really kind to them. Now, oftentimes the gleaners were abused or picked on or mistreated just because they were, picking up the scraps, and they were kind of a little bit lower on the totem pole, and so they got poorly treated. Boaz sees Ruth, and he's saying, "Don't go anywhere. You are safe here. You will be protected. And in addition, this is huge. He's saying, you can come and drink from the same jugs that the harvesters are drinking from." This is extraordinary. Something about Ruth is striking a chord in Boaz's heart. We'll find out here. Verse 10, then she bowed down. Face to the ground, she replied to him, "How is it that I found favor in your eyes, that you notice me? I'm an immigrant." So she's not an Israelite. So this is like a really awesome thing that Boaz is doing, because he's going beyond his own people and showing a foreigner the same sort of generosity. Verse 11, Boaz responded to her, everything that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband's death has been reported fully to me. How you left behind your father, your mother, and the land of your birth, and came to a people you hadn't known beforehand. May the Lord reward you for your deed. May you receive a rich reward from the Lord, for God, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to seek refuge. She said, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, sir, because you've comforted me, and because you've spoken kindly to me, your female servant, even though I'm not one of your female servants." This is pretty awesome. So Boaz is doing all this. He's reaching out to her. And what's cool about this is Ruth is just doing her thing, right? But without saying a single thing, Boaz already hears about her character, not because she was tooting her own horn, but simply because she was doing an honorable thing. So then furthermore, this is how Boaz treats her. Verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, eat some of the bread, and dip your piece of vinegar." She sat among the harvesters, and he served roasted grain to her. She ate, was satisfied, and had leftovers. Then she got up to glean. Now Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her glean between the bundles, and don't humiliate her. Also pull out some from the bales for her, and leave some behind for her to glean, and don't scold her." Friends, we've been through enough situations in our history, in our society, in the ways that we have treated people of difference to know that this is another one of those situations where you don't invite the foreigners to come and eat with you. They don't sit on the same blanket. This is their blanket, their place to eat what they brought, and this is where we sit. There was segregation in those times. You didn't cross those boundaries. It was like peeing in public. It's just something that you don't do. Boaz is honorable in the ways that he says, Ruth, come over here. You are an honorable person. Eat with us. And eat until you are full. So the rest of the story is awesome. So we just skip to verse 19 here. She told her, she finishes the day, then she tells her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz. Naomi, who formerly thought that God had absolutely left her by the wayside and didn't care a lick about her, says these words, verse 20, may he be blessed by the Lord who hasn't abandoned his faithfulness with the living or with the dead. Naomi said to her, the man is one of your close relatives. He is one of our redeemers. And so you see how humility begins to play into this. Now Ruth, if she were trying to find a man, just trying to snag someone and maybe just get back up on her feet to get out of destitution, probably would have been acting a lot differently. To go to the field and sweat all day long is not a good place for someone who's just trying to catch a man. Okay? Instead, Ruth would have been flirting, trying to impress the men, maybe begging and making sure her situation was known. She might have been dressing the part to catch some attention, swooning, or acting out in other ways. Instead, in Ruth's humility, she is out in the field, working hard, minding her own business, making an honest way to take care of her and her mother-in-law. Boaz as well, a perfect demonstration of humility. If Boaz was trying to win the heart of a young lady and build himself up, he probably would have been putting others down. He would have been talking about his title, about his land and the expanse of it, about his valor in giving permission for Ruth to be there and to do these things. Instead, Boaz, in an honorable and humble way, simply gives Ruth protection and permission to glean there, and an invitation accompanied with dignity. You can see how humility is working in both of these people's hearts and their lives. Now, the thing that we know today is that humility goes a long way, and in fact, a lot farther than we think. Because oftentimes we like to reduce humility to just being humble, right? And so we think, okay, well, that's a small piece of the pie. But this is in your worship outline this morning. What we say today is that humility is the sunlight that causes relationship to grow. Now, we're going to be bold enough to say that without humility in your relationships, whether it's with your parents, your spouse, your children, your coworkers, and God especially, without humility, your relationships will struggle to grow. Dictionary describes or says that humility is something like this: a modest view of oneself. Now, it doesn't mean a low view of oneself, a discounted or poor view of someone's else. It simply means it's an uninflated view of oneself. I see myself how I am. The opposite of humility then is pride and arrogance, the desire or the need to build oneself up larger or bigger than that person is or feels he or she is. Proverbs chapter 29:23 says, pride lays people low, but those of humble spirit gain honor. Pride and arrogance bring people low, just the opposite of what it's attempting to do. Now, it's no surprise that Jesus also speaks about humility. We turn to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4. It's just a little touchy today. Need a better volunteer microphone here. Chapter 14, verses 7 through 11. And this is the lesson that Jesus teaches about humility. Verse 7, when Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. Go figure. That's what Jesus does. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, Jesus says, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give up your seat to this other person. Embarrassed, Jesus says, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, Jesus says, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, friend, move up to a better seat. Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. So even Jesus is talking about this thing that we call humility and allowing yourself just to be okay with who you are rather than building yourself up. In fact, what I like to say is that if you see yourself oftentimes as more important or harder working or higher contributing, whether it's in your relationships or your church or your work, your faith, your family, Jesus, it is likely that you are invalidating others and inflating your own value beyond its own worth. Invalidating others, because in our absence of humility, we forget to look at how others are contributing. There was one day when I had a moment of lapse in my humility in my house, and I felt like I was doing everything to pick up after my wife, who was busy driving, by the way, to Omaha every day for school each way. And finally, I think God was working on my heart, and finally I started looking around, and I saw my shoes that I didn't put away neatly stacked right underneath the coat hanger. I saw all the magazines all neatly tucked away. All these things started coming to my view, and I felt so embarrassed. And so when Sarah came home that night, I said, I'm so sorry that I didn't see all the things that you're doing. You see, when we get arrogant, when we think that we're the ones carrying all the weight, we invalidate the value of other people. When viewing others, if you automatically assume that you are working harder and making better choices than others, then you can at least be sure of one thing that other people are doing better than you, and that's humility. And so we remember that humility is not a low self-esteem, but instead it is a low need to build yourself up. Now, in this low need of building ourselves up, we need some sort of confidence, some sort of assurance, some sort of source of value that doesn't come from us. Romans chapter 15, 17 reminds us, so in Christ Jesus I brag about things that have to do with God. And so in your worship outline this morning, we remember that that what we are doing is finding our value and our assurance not in ourselves or the things that we do or the ways that we build ourselves up, but in what God does. And so we know that we are least humble when we are the least assured of who we are in the arms and in the beauty and the eyes of Jesus Christ. So we said this morning that humility is like sunlight for relationships with God, with people, with Jesus, with our family. And so in your worship outline this morning, the first thing that we say about humility is that it heightens the need for our relationship with God, for God's presence in our lives. If we are to be humble, then we know that the source of our value comes from God, from a holy source. And so it heightens our need, and it's okay to need God. It's actually a really good thing. Humility also decreases the chances for our personal insecurities. If we are okay with being humble in our relationships, in the ways that we behave and conduct ourselves, then we don't any longer look at ourselves as being incomplete, imperfect, or less than others. Instead, we say, I am who I am, and it is good. And it is good to see it that way. Finally, humility increases the values that you see in others. When we finally have a chance to be humble in our hearts and our approach to faith, then we finally see all of the things that God is doing, that Jesus has done and continues to work into our lives. When we are not very humble in our situations, it's really hard to see how hard God is working and pouring into our lives. And so humility allows us to see with clearer eyes. As we learn from both Boaz and Ruth today about humility and the way that it brings people together and the way that it highlights their faith and the way that it exposes how God is working in our lives, let us be mindful of this, and let's let this be a part of our lives too. Remembering that humility truly is the sunlight of our relationships, whether they are holy or earthly. Let us pray.